Thank you all for being here. As a local Chicagoan of many years, I'd like to welcome you to the city. I know you've been here for a couple days. I love the city a lot. And as most big cities go, some of you may have some conceptions and impressions about a city, some of which are true, some of which may not be so true. Like, for example, Obama does live here, or at least he has a house here in Hyde Park. And yes, that is Trevor Noah when he was filming The Daily Show here at one point last year or 2 years ago. But one fact that's not so true is that people tend to call Chicago the Windy City. And that's actually not because it's windy, even though it is windy. It's because in the late 19th century, politicians were known as like windy and full of hot air. Bet you didn't think you would learn something new, but here you are. Last talk of the day, so we're gonna make this a good one. So the talk today is going serverless with VueJS. My name is Divya Sasidharan. I go by short Div online, Divya in real life, Div if you know me very well, and I work at Netlify. How many of you have used or are familiar with Netlify? A few of you, wonderful. So we have a booth. We might not have a booth anymore. But Netlify is a company that builds tools and workflows to help you deploy your front-end applications. If you want to know more, my coworker Keiko is here, and Ryan is probably like closing shop out there, and we're happy to talk to you about that if you're interested. And so I'm going to use this as an opportunity, because it's the last talk, to tell you a story, and this whole talk will be in the form of a story. And I'm going to use this narrative device, which is the hero's journey. And that's a very popular trope that's used in a lot of stories you know of. So Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and so on use this as a narrative device to tell the story. And the hero's journey usually follows a protagonist as they go through a series of steps in the story. And if you're just to break it down, there are about 12 steps. It's a lot. But the idea is it often starts with the ordinary world. And then there is a call to adventure of some form, which then kickstarts the story. And then there's a series of other steps that happens. But for this talk, we're going to break it down into overarching sections. And so the first section is this idea of departure. And that's usually the start of the story, where the protagonist gets the call to adventure, sometimes refuses because they're very comfortable. But then they meet someone, a wise man, woman, someone else who tells them otherwise, and then that pushes them to cross that threshold. And then the second stage is this idea of initiation, the start and the end of their journey, or like the actual core of the entire story. And so there is tests that they're met with, enemies and so on, and then they have to beat some kind of a challenge. So there's like the Innermost Cave, and there's an ordeal, like some kind of a huge battle that they have to fight. And then usually they emerge victorious, because otherwise there won't be a story if the protagonist dies. And they get some kind of reward as a result of winning this huge fight. And then the end of that is this idea of return. So they come back into the real world. So they were in a separate world. They come back into the real world. There is a road back, so they journey back. Sometimes there's a resurrection if they had died and then come back, like in Coco. And then they, of course, usually bring with them like some kind of solution or elixir that will solve all of the world's problems and answer the life, the universe, and everything else there is. And so with that, we'll start Act 1 of this story, which is departure. And so I'd like to introduce to you, we're going to start with the ordinary world, because we have to set the scene for our story. And so I'd like to introduce the first protagonist. This is Sammy Cerberus, in no way related to the character from Harry Potter. And Sammy Cerberus is a server worker or a DevOps person. I'm clearly not a DevOps person, but comes from a long line of DevOps and server people and knows everything there is about server architecture and backend and so on. And Sammy has this whiteboard in which she architects how all the application in the companies work. And so as long as this whiteboard doesn't get erased, Sammy knows exactly how things work. And so her company comes to her, because the company is based in Chicago, obviously, and they build this application which allows you to rate pizza places in the city, because in Chicago people like pizza a lot. Or maybe it's just me. And so this application allows you to see pizza places and then rate them, and you have a map and so on. And basically, it's a full stack application. So you have like some front-end logic, some REST APIs, you have a database that saves your ratings, maybe some authentication, so there's users involved, and then there might be additional configuration like routing and whatever else. And so with that, with the scene set, we can now figure out the call to adventure. And so the call to adventure is that this site becomes super popular, and it gets front page of this orange news site. And so it garners a lot of hits, a lot of users, people are using it, which is wonderful because the company gets revenue somehow. And everyone's celebrating except for Sammy because all the servers are on fire. Because the servers can't handle that load. They have an architecture that works for a small user base, but not for thousands and hundreds of thousands of hits. And so everything goes down. There are fires everywhere. Clearly servers go on fire when there's too much load. And all the website serves now is a 503 service temporarily unavailable, which is very frustrating because now the company people aren't being able to access the website, which is bad. But Sammy is not one to back down from challenge because she has her whiteboard that does not get erased. So she goes to the whiteboard, and of course she refuses to back down from a challenge. And so because the architecture has worked, always has worked from as long as she can remember, she decides that the solution is that they need more servers. And so they build more servers, the manager approves it, and so as a result, they just have lots and lots of servers, and all of it gets used because there are lots of users at this point in time, and everyone is happy and goes back to celebrating and being happy and revenue and etc. The issue is that with all sites that are front page of the orange news site, they start to go down over time and become not as popular. And so that results in servers not getting used. And so some servers are idle, and then more servers are idle, and then more servers are idle. And that makes Sammy very sad because now she is hurting all these servers, but not all of them get used. And so there's a lot of wastage that's happening. There's a lot of money that the company is spending, and it's frustrating for everyone. And Sammy's manager, who is obviously not Dumbledore, comes in and yells at Sammy saying that you need to fix this because we're using up a lot of resources, we're wasting a lot of money, and this is not a really good use of our time and money and energy. And so Sammy goes to the whiteboard and screams at it saying like, you worked all this time, but why aren't you working now? And obviously because the whiteboard can't be erased, she scribbles on it just to erase everything because clearly the system doesn't work. And Sammy's frustrated and decides to take a walk. And on her walk, she meets someone, in this case a mentor, who gives her some advice. So that moves us to this person, who I like to call Swami Scale-A-Lot, because Swami Scale-A-Lot knows how to scale things. He scaled a lot of applications, has a lot of experience, and knows how things work. And with all wise sages, they usually have cryptic quotes in which they give out advice. And so Swami Server-A-Lot says, "Man who runs servers without servers accomplish many things." And so Sammy doesn't understand what this means because it's very cryptic and doesn't actually explain anything. But of course, like all wise people, they don't explain themselves because they want you to figure it out. And so this kind of brings us to the crossing the threshold part, where Sammy starts mulling things over and figuring out what exactly she wants to do. And so she looks at the current architecture, which is this. It's kind of full stack, monolithic. There's a front end, there's a back end, but everything and all the logic and functionality is kind of mungled together. And she starts to think, maybe I could pull everything apart. So all of my logic and functionality are served via microservices. So there's kind of a decoupled approach. My front end is served on the client side. My back end logic is on the back end. And maybe I could even go one step further and put a lot of my backend logic on the cloud, which gives me the ability, or gives, in this case, me being Sammy, the ability to not have to manage and micromanage those servers and making sure that everything scales when they need to scale. And so Sammy takes this on and decides to go into the cloud because that's where the future is. And so this brings us to Act 2, because we've set the scene, we have a journey, and now we can come into the actual meat of the story, which is the initiation. And so every time a new chapter happens, there's always a lot of haters. And in this case, Sammy's haters are her coworkers who say there are still servers in serverless. So technically, serverless is not serverless. And Sammy doesn't care, actually, because people can say whatever they want to say. But she perseveres, and she goes to the manager. The manager okays it and says, well, if this is your one shot, go figure it out. And so this brings us to the challenge of actually figuring out how things work. And so this is the Innermost Cave. And so we have an application, and now we want to tease the layers apart. And so we want to grab the front-end logic and make that its own piece without having to rely on the other pieces of the code. So let's go back to our application, which is this pizza rating app. I called it Chai Pie, so I'm just going to refer to it as that now. So in this case, with Chai Pie, there is certain pieces and elements to it. There is the points on the map, and there is the actual pizza locations. And that data comes directly from Yelp. So in order for Yelp to work, you need a server. Ordinarily, you could run an Express server. So here we have an Express server that uses the Yelp Fusion API, which is what we're using in this case. And then from that, we're specifying a route, which is /yelpit/ and then it gives you the term being like pizza or coffee or whatever food you want. And then a location, which is like Chicago or San Francisco, or pick whatever location you want. And then with that, we will give Yelp our access token, the client ID and secret, and then we'll initialize the client with that access token, which then allows us to run search and so on. So this is just like a cursory way of doing server-side logic if you want to run a query, a Yelp query, because you need it to run on the server. You can't do it client-side. But of course, because it is a separate server, you'll run into CORS issues because you're on, like, let's say localhost 8080 if you're running Vue, your Express app runs on localhost 8000, there's a CORS issue that you'll run into. And so in your Webpack config, you're going to have to specify the dev server, and then you have to proxy it to a specific URL, and then you target it. And so there's additional things that have to happen. So there's a lot of code that you have to write in order for you to just do one thing, which is request pizza places from Yelp, which seems kind of crazy, which is why, in this case, Sammy Serverless decides to do functions as a service, because that is what we call serverless now. And so for this, we're going to use Netlify, because it's the one I'm most familiar with. But Netlify actually runs on AWS Lambda, so ta-da, it's kind of like something that all of you are familiar with, probably. And to run a function in Netlify, all you have to do is you create a functions folder in your root. So if you have a Vue project, you can create it in your root folder structure. And then you would create a JavaScript file. In this case, I call it hello.js because it's just a generic hello.js file. That's one way of creating a Netlify serverless function in Netlify. The other way to do it is via the Netlify CLI. With the Netlify CLI, you get access to a specific command, which is Netlify functions create, and that gives you the ability to use boilerplate code. So it gives you a prompt, you can get the hello world example, and then automagically you have that folder structure with your code in it without you having to do much. So you could go either route, create it yourself or use Netlify CLI for it. And then the last thing to do is specify the function folder in your netlify.toml file. So netlify.toml is what Netlify uses to know exactly how to run functions and code. So for this, we'll just specify where exactly Netlify should find that functions folder. Because we called our folder functions, we're going to just do functions equals functions. But you can feel free to call it whatever you want. Just specify in the netlify.toml file. And so if you deploy this, so if you push everything to GitHub and you connect the repo to Netlify, you'll see in the Netlify dashboard all of the functions that you've created. I've obviously created more than the hello.js, as you can see, but you see the hello.js there. And so as you can tell, like, the function is up and running and everything works. And what happens when you do this is that now Netlify gives you a URL in which you can access that function that's directly in the URL that you're already running your code in. So if you're running localhost 8080, now you can do /.netlify/functions and then whatever your function name is. So here it's /hello, and then you automatically have that proxying capability without you having to do a lot, which is super cool. But for our purposes, hello is just an example, but for our purposes, we want to request the Yelp API because that is how we get the pizza places, because it's very important. And so to write that, the serverless function in Netlify usually does exports.handler equals function in which you write your code and you provide it with a callback. So here we have our code, and then we create our client. We pass that client the API key. So with this, you can have your environment variables and so on. You pass that in. And then in your query parameters, in this case, I'm not using URL string parameters. I'm using query parameters that are sent as a body. So I'm just doing event.query string parameters, which is the body. And then I'm grabbing that term in that location. And then I am passing that down to the client.search. So search request is where that term in that location is. And so that search gets passed down. And so in the callback, I can then give myself or give the application the results that I want it to. So it's in the body itself, JSON.stringify, and then pass down results. And so once we have that function, we can now move into our actual Vue code. This is a Vue talk, and I haven't talked about Vue at all yet, and it's been 15 minutes. But here you go. This is some Vue code. So what we'll do is we'll create, let's say I have a slider component, and I want that data to be used in that. So let's say we have a data property called Yelp data, and the features is where exactly those pizza places are. So in the mounted, what I'm doing is I'm just using Axios to query that route, so /.netlify/functions/Yelp it. And then from there, I'm passing it those query string parameters that I mentioned in my serverless function. And then in the then, I'm just parsing that data. And then here is an additional functional util step that I'm doing, which is GeoJSONifying it, which essentially takes the data that I got from Yelp and turns it into something that I can put on a map, because Yelp doesn't necessarily give it to me in a GeoJSON format, so I have to do it myself. And then all I'm doing is I'm passing that and setting it as a data property, which is something that you would do in Vue. So I have Yelp data, and I'm just passing that down quite easily. And so another way of doing this, as you saw earlier, I put all of my logic in my mounted. You could do it that way. But one other way of implementing it is via Vuex. And so I use Vuex modules. So normally, if you use Vuex, it automatically creates like a global scope for you. So every time you add things, it's on the global scope. And sometimes you want things modularized because you want your authentication state somewhere else from your review state, for instance. So in this case, I'm using module logic in my Vuex. So that means that I have a folder structure like source, state, and reviews.js. I'll share my code after this. So if you're interested in learning more, feel free to dig into that. All there is to that logic in that module, and the way modules work, is that you're exporting every single Vuex state. So there's a state, there's mutations and actions. So you're exporting every piece of it, which then exposes that via the module in a Vue application. So I have my state, which is the Yelp data that I mentioned, which is null because it is empty. And then in my actions is where the actual things happen. So in this case, I'm getting Yelp. So get Yelp is the specific action that I'm doing. And then I'm doing that Axios get, which is what I mentioned in the mounted earlier. So I'm getting that from my URL. And then in the commit, once everything works, the code is the same as I showed you previously. Assuming everything works, I'm just committing that in my mutation. So in my mutation, I'm just grabbing that state, and then I'm setting it to that value that gets passed through. So that's exactly how I would do it. The same thing that I showed you in mounted in Vuex. So it's much more clean and easier to work with. And then moving back into our Vue component, So let's say I showed you the slider logic earlier, but the way to put that into practice is that in Vuex, you would have to import map state and map actions. That gives you access to using the Vuex store. And then once you do that in my methods, I would use map actions. I would get that specific module. Remember I mentioned that in Vuex, the way you do if you do modularized Vuex, you have to specify everything is scoped to the specific module. So I called my module reviews. So map actions, reviews, gives me all the state that's within reviews only and nothing else. So it's very specific. And so I'm grabbing that get Yelp action, which is what queries and gets the Yelp data. And then I'm calling that specific function directly, because it gives me access to it within the scope of the component. And then map state just gives me access to that state. Because I already ran the action has been done and completed, and then now I have access to that specific mutated state. And so that's what I can use to put into my slider data. So Yelp data.features is specifically because it's GeoJSON data, so don't get hung up on that. It's just the idea of the data getting passed through. So the next part of all of this is the database layer. So we have the ability to grab all that data from Yelp, which is great, but we're not building Yelp, we're building something else. We're building ChiPy. And so the next piece of ChiPy is the rating piece, because Yelp is great and all, but Yelp doesn't allow you to rate specific things without you writing a long review and so on. It's a bit different. At least I think it is. And so the next piece of it is this ability of adding a review. And so review is pretty much the same to grabbing data from Yelp. So I'm not going to create a separate module for it. I'm going to use the same module that we've already created, because it's essentially similar in nature. And so for this, in order for a database, I'm going to use Firebase. And so Firebase has obviously their own way of doing things. We're going to initialize Firebase, and then we're going to use Firestore in this case. They have docs. Don't get hung up on the documentation. But I'm essentially grabbing a collection. So in my Firestore, I have this idea of users, and then pizza stores, and so on. So I'm grabbing that user, and then I have a collection called pizza places, which gives me a bunch of pizza places. Again, Firebase-specific stuff. And then I do the get, which then gives me access to so on. I think, yeah, so all of this is very Firebase-specific, but the part that I want you to keep in mind is this ability of using Vuex as a store and running actions within Vuex, because it's a really great way of persisting state across your applications. And so with this, we have our Firebase store, we have all of our Yelp data, but of course, there is some kind of an ordeal that happens, because every great story has a challenge greater than the ones that we already talked about. And so authentication is a key piece of this, because in order for the application to work and be useful, you need a user account, or you need a way of managing user accounts. Because if I rate a pizza place, for instance, I like Pequods and Jets, really good, great places, but someone else might like Illuminati's, because apparently it's very popular on Yelp. And I don't want my rating to mess with your rating, because obviously my rating is better. And so this is where I'm going to use Netlify Identity. You can use Auth0 or any other serverless authentication strategies. They're all fairly similar. But I'm going to use Netlify Identity in this case. And Netlify Identity runs under the hood. It's GoTrue, which is a Go-based framework. And so for this, again, we're going to go back to our Vuex store in order for my authentication to work. So I mentioned a little earlier that I had reviews as a Vuex module, and now I have authentication as a separate Vuex module. And that's because I want them to be separate, because they are not the same. So the first thing I'll do in my Vuex store is I will initialize the GoTrue module. So assuming that you npm/yarn installed, you can then import the module, and then you initialize it using a new, and then you pass it an API URL. In this case, it's ChiPy, and then there's additional configuration that happens. There's docs that show you all of this, but again, I want to show you the Vuex part of it. And so in our actions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do call a function called attempt login. And all attempt login is doing is attempt login. And so the idea is that it dispatches an attempt confirmation. So the reason I'm doing it this way is because when a user logs in, there are two types of login. There's one which is when a user logs in for the first time. Let's say you click on a confirmation, you sign up for a service, and then you get an email and you click on that and it bumps you back to the login page. That's your first time ever logging in. That gives you an access token, which the application needs in order to create you as a user. There's the separate login, which is you're someone who's come back frequently to an application. And so those two logins are fairly similar but different. The first instance uses an access token and requires that in order to create and authenticate that user for the first time. The second doesn't. And I don't want to create two separate actions for that because it seems fairly pedantic. So attempt confirmation just checks that a user exists in the system. And again, that's code that you can look at later on in my GitHub, in my repo. But that's why there is that specific call that happens. So a dispatch is when you're calling a separate Vuex action, which you can do. So I'm dispatching that, and only when that action completes, then I want to continue everything else. So assuming that attempt confirmation resolves, I will then log the user in using their email and their password. And then once I do that, I can commit the response as a user to my state. And the reason for this is, again, I can grab the refresh token, JWT, anything else that I might need later on in my application. And so I have a mutation called set current user, and all that does is it sets the specific state of that user, or the current user state. And so moving back to the Vue component, we have a login component here, which just consists of a single form with a couple of input elements. So a login component is fairly straightforward. All it has is two input elements with maybe a label attached around it. It's just like the email and a password, or a username and a password. And so for this, I'm going to use a form, which allows me to then submit data. And so in Vue, you have access to events. So @submit is just an event that I can bind to my form. So every time a user clicks a button in a form element, it submits the form, and I can grab that and pass it into a method. So here, whenever a form is submitted, so every time a button is pressed, in this case, a button with type submit is pressed, the login method will get called. So that's what you see there. And then I'm binding every input to a specific data property. And I'm using vModel here because then every time a user types, it updates the data property. You can do it this way, or you could do it by having it explicitly doing every time you would do @input and then change the data property as needed. But vModel is nice because it gives you two-way data binding out of the hood. So login.creds, email and password are two data properties in my data property. And so you see that a little bit here where I have that login creds with email and password. And so when I do a vModel, that gives me automatic two-way data binding. I don't have to update it explicitly, which is super nice. And then because we created that attempt login function in Vuex, we can use it. So we'll grab it via map actions, and then we'll attempt that login. In this, as you can see, I'm grabbing a token because the URL gives me that token, assuming a user is a first-time user, and I can pass that on if needed. And then it attempts the login, and then it does a thing called transfer to dashboard. And what that is just a Vue router thing. I didn't talk about Vue router, but it's just the idea of I have a login page, and then I have a dashboard page. And using Vue router, I can just push people through using router.push instead of having to do some other thing. So I'm just redirecting users once they actively log in. So everything works. The application is up and running. And so we come to the point of the challenge has been met. And so reward awaits. And so once we have all of this, we have access to various configurations. And so whenever a user is created in a system, this is the Netlify dashboard. You can set a role for every single user. So in this particular instance, I'm the only one who signed up for my service. And so Divya at Netlify.com has a role of editor versus hello@shortdiv.com, also me, who is a visitor. And so there's this idea of different roles. And so with authentication comes this idea of authorization, where whenever a user is authenticated, they have a specific role, which then gives them permission to go to specific routes. So if I'm an editor or an admin, I get access to an admin dashboard. If you're a visitor, you only get access to maybe just the dashboard, but you can't change it ever. So that's a really nice thing once you have a authentication layer like inbuilt into an application. You have access to authorization and a lot of logic that comes there with, like redirects and so on. And so with all of this niceties that we've created, we can return back into the real world because we have a working application and we can bring to our manager. And so the road back continues. And so Sammy feels much smarter as a result of all that has happened. And so now Sammy starts speaking in cryptic quotes, which is that there is no cloud, just someone else's server, because ultimately it doesn't matter. You're still running server code, but in this case, it's nice because serverless code just scales automatically. And so we come to the final piece, which is resurrection. And so Sammy now has this idea and is totally on board into this idea of serverless. The Vue app works, everything is in working condition, and Sammy no longer has to be on call. And so as a result, there's a lot of power that Sammy now has to do and work on other pieces of the company instead of having to micromanage servers in order to manage scale and so on. And so everyone is happy as a result. And Sammy can now is emerging victorious as a result. And if any of you are interested, my application is actually live, and I'm running it locally. So feel free to play with it. It's actually, so currently it's tripy.netlify.live, which is a local tunnel. So once I pull that down, it will not work. But if you change live to .com, it will work because that's the deployed version. This is the development version. And with that, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Since it is the last talk of the day, I will post my slides online onto Noticed, which is where a lot of speakers post their slides. And I'm told that you should rate the session, but you can if you'd like. Otherwise, it's totally cool. So thank you.